Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. Very happy to be joined today, once again, by a new author for us, Paul Schutz, who has written A Theology of Flourishing, the Fullness of Life for All Creation. Paul received his doctorate from Fordham University. I know he studied with the great Elizabeth Johnson, who wrote the foreword for this book. And he is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. I noticed right from the beginning in the foreword that the first line of the book is from Beth Johnson, who says, flourishing is a word, a concept, a goal that is currently having its moment in the sun. And it at least certainly receives full exposure in this book. It's one of those books that takes like a word like hope or revolution or liberation or something like that, and opens up your mind and your imagination to what it would look like if this kind of concept or this word was the foundation or the lens for our doing theology and imagining what the gospel life is all about. So maybe you could begin by telling us a little bit about what flourishing means and how it functions as the foundation of this theology in this book.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really appreciate your starting there with Beth and what she said, because she and so many other great thinkers in the liberationist, feminist, queer traditions have been talking about flourishing from various angles for a long time. And I tried to do what you said, to sort of set that up as a starting point, a center for our reflection on what it means to be Christian, what theology is all about, and then trace that out. So in the book, I understand flourishing as one of the words that I use a lot is self-actualization. And I'm really careful about how I use that for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't want it to sound like some sort of enlightenment, coming to an awakening of some sort of intellectual privilege or something like that. Really, most basically, it's just becoming, as humans at least, who God has created us to be, coming into the fullness of ourselves, being liberated, experiencing the conditions that make it possible for us humans to be the fullness of who God intends us to be. And then beyond that, the fullness of life for all creation, the subtitle is also to live in a world where conditions exist that make it possible for all creatures to experience and enter into the fullness of what they are, both individually and collectively. So this sort of actualization of the self of a human person or another creature is this interconnected, relational, engaged sort of coming to be coming into that fullness. And when I say, liberated to discern what it means to come into that fullness, what that means is that structurally, socially, environmentally, ecologically, the conditions that enable that, conditions of justice and peace, right, mercy and harmony, have to exist so that people are free. Creatures are free to enter into that fullness. So that's kind of a broad idea of what I mean by flourishing.
I really like the way you lay that out, because flourishing can sound like a project of kind of self-actualization and meditation and yoga and living in a kind of gated community where everything is provided, or prosperity, and you have prosperity, whatever.
Ask me about,
or you're making it clear that there's a a social critique in here about the forces in society that inhibit or prevent or stifle that capacity for flourishing. Going back to like what are the key texts, for you from the gospel, of course, from the Gospel of John 10:10. Why don't you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the thief comes only to kill and steal and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. That famous line. I think one of the things that in my reflection on that phrase and my research on that phrase that struck me was that often we talk about the second part only. We go to the abundant life, right?
Yeah.
But in this, Jesus says, I have come and that they may have life and have it abundantly. Well, that's sort of my starting point. Christ proclaimed this, but I actually think that proclamation of abundant life is consistent with who God is throughout the entirety of Revelation. And so for Christ to come and to proclaim, I have come that they may have life, it makes sense incarnationally as an expression, a self-expression of who we believe God to be, because since the very beginning, God created a world that was meant to be full of abundant life, that was made for abundance, that was made for flourishing, that was made for fullness. And so Christ's proclamation follows the logic, in my understanding, and this is what I trace through the tradition, of the idea that God's fundamental intention for the universe is that all things may not just live, but flourish in community with one another. But then there's that first part, right? And when we focus on the second part, it can collapse into sort of a nice, maybe a little bit saccharine, idea of abundant life or goodness, or we can be reductionistic about it and say it's about this or it's about that. But Jesus is contrasting two things in this parable. And the first part is he's contrasting himself as the shepherd or the gate, the one that keeps the sheep, that's the context, with the idea of the thief who comes to kill and steal and destroy. And so that really is the foundation, as you said, for that social critique, right? To start with flourishing, to make flourishing our lens on the world and the tradition, first, not just requires, but empowers us to look at the world that we live in, to look at the church that we live in and say, in what ways is the gospel being used to kill and steal and destroy? In what ways are social structures and systems killing and stealing and destroying? It is depriving people, depriving creatures of all kinds of their ability and their right to flourish, their right to enter into that fullness of life. And so whatever the gospel means, I have come that they may have life, whatever that means, it has to be understood in contrast to those forces of death, those forces of that steal, that extract, that destroy. And so there's out of that this dynamic, as in liberation theology, of denunciation and enunciation that comes out, where it says we have to denounce the forces of death, denounce the forces that are contrary to God's life-giving intentions for all creation, and then announce a new way of being Christian that says, this is what our tradition is for. And so that's how I use that verse as an anchor for my argument.
I think this is where you also take a more radical fundamental turn, because it's not just that we come to have life in abundance, but contrasting that with a tradition in which that life in abundance is projected into heaven or to a future life, and you're bringing it back to the reality of this world, and that's a whole different kind of way of thinking of what salvation means.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, in that thought, I think we see it in Gutierrez, we see it in Johnson, we see it in a lot of people, right? In glimpses. But I think that, building on that tradition, which is what I'm doing in the book, taking flourishing as that core concept allows us to kind of see it in a new light, to see that problematic in a new light. And this is not to deny, right, that, heavenly fulfillment is, an ultimate goal of Christianity. It is part of the tradition. But what I want to do by centering on flourishing is to say, whatever it means to experience heavenly fulfillment, salvation in heaven, right, in union with God, is not detached from this world, but intrinsically connected to it. And so the meaning of salvation, as we understand it in heaven, is rooted in the way in which Christian life functions to build the reign of God on earth. And there's this great moment in the writings of Ray Brown, the Catholic biblical scholar, that I found where he makes this point reading the Gospel of John, and he says, whatever it means, this is not, we can't just settle for the salvation of souls, that traditional language. We can't just settle for the salvation of souls. We have to be thinking of the meaning of this for the world that we live in, and that because the gospel obviously is pointing in that direction. And I think that when we start with flourishing, right, as this creaturely, coming into the fullness of what we are in this world, we see that traditional model that really solely focuses, and I think that word solely or exclusively focuses on heavenly salvation or the salvation of souls, misses or even unintentionally, maybe in some cases intentionally, sort of truncates the critical potential of the gospel to be a force of revolutionary love for this world, which I think is also part and parcel of our tradition. Because if we're always looking to heaven, then the idea is that, well, we're trying to get out of this world, right? And so it's easy to sort of leave concern for this world behind. But if we start with flourishing and we say the fulfillment of flourishing is heavenly salvation, but it starts here, then it refocuses our attention on this world and not just on sort of individual morality or something like that, but it refocuses us on the structures and conditions and systems of this world and says, okay, in what ways are those structures, conditions, systems, the church included, institutions, fostering that fullness of life, and in what ways are they not? And in that sense, I think that those traditional notions of salvation that are limited to heavenly fulfillment, they're not sufficient to really bring us into the vision of the reign of God that Christ proclaimed, which is a reign of, mercy and justice and, truth and peace and all those things. And it has to be both. And so I think flourishing can give us a lens to help us, tease out the dynamics of that both a little bit more.
I really like that because, traditionally in a lot of spirituality, there's this complete sort of disjunction between life in this world, which is a vale of tears, mourning and suffering, etc. In which if we praise, worship, obey God or whatever, we will be rewarded in the next life with real happiness, the real thing. And everything in this life, every kind of happiness, every kind of flourishing is just a very pale, almost insignificant version of
Some
the
kind of
thing.
happiness or kind of...
Yeah, so everything that you do here is sort of instrumental in some way to enjoy that reward, rather than when you kind of use this sort of metaphor of flourishing, you can imagine this sort of continuity between between life that affirms that flourishing and contrasts against the anti-flourishing kind of principles of society, and that ultimate goal. So that, in other words, it's like talking about a praxis of heaven or something like that.
It's
a way of living by the Spirit, by the values, by the impulse of a life-giving God, creating God, in this life, and that prepares us for and anticipates the goal that we're anticipating or we're looking forward to.
That's exactly right. And in some ways, I think it's kind of simple. It's almost too simple in a way, because one of the questions that always comes up when I talk about this stuff is people will say, well, does flourishing sort of lead us down the primrose path to Pelagianism, right? Or something like that. This sort of, self-actualization, like we can do it all ourselves. We can say, no, absolutely not, right? It is only by, as you say, radical openness to the grace of God made known by the Holy Spirit in the world that any sort of flourishing, as I'm understanding it, is possible. It is the love of God that is the anchor of that, but the love of God accepted by us, and allowing that love, which I describe as revolutionary in the book. It's a revolutionary force to get inside us and transform us and bring us to life in new ways, and that then animates us to work on behalf of the God's life-giving intention. So all of that is good. The part that I think is kind of simple, or maybe I'm oversimplifying it, I don't know, but the idea that I would say is, if a person lives like that, if a person radically accepts the Holy Spirit, if we as human communities and societies accept, and as the church as an institution accept the Spirit, listen to the Spirit with radical humility and openness, and let that challenge that comes to us be actualized in our lives individually and collectively, then of course, right, heaven, as it has traditionally been understood, is going to be, we're still going to sin, we're still going to commit individual fault, but and society is still going to, have its struggles, structural sin and such, but we're going to work on behalf of that reign of God in a way that I'm pretty sure is going to lead people to heaven. It's sort of, it seems like, rather than striving for something that seems so far beyond what we can ever achieve, let's live according to that radical love of God in this world and be assured through that the promise of heavenly salvation, will be ours. And which is, I think, what the tradition has always taught. It's just sort of reorienting the directionality, following a different trajectory in a sense, but toward the same end.
Dorothy Day always liked to quote Catherine of Siena, who said,
Mm.
all the way to heaven is heaven. And that, you could take that in terms of a kind of individual, personal sort of spirituality. I mean, holiness is the way to heaven, etc.
Yeah.
But when you kind of understand that kind of holiness as involving care for the rest of creation as well, not just my individual soul, then it takes on a different contour.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that the point that I really try to emphasize is that when we start with flourishing, that becomes not just indispensable, but it sort of flows naturally from Christian life. It's sort of, we start with saying God has this fundamental life-giving intention that all things experience the fullness of life. Okay, then how do we talk about racism, right? Okay, then how do we talk about transphobia? Okay, well, then how do we talk about, the degradation of our ecosystems or the oppression of women, in a particular social context? Well, obviously, if God intends that fullness of life, there is that necessary, critique that comes in there, and we can't. But what I appreciate, or I think what turned me on in some ways to the idea of flourishing, what got me excited about it, is that it does that sort of naturally, and I also think it does that in a way that feels positive. All the way to heaven is heaven, right? It feels like we are truly entering into a deeper relationship with a God who desires that fullness for us and for others. And by framing, it frames the relationship with God, right? The spiritual life in that way, in such a way that, I've found that people will say flourishing sounds like such a positive concept, and yet it has all these like critical dimensions to it. And I say, yes, that's the point, but it makes it a little bit more accessible in a way that, and also feels like, we are really being held by the love of God and called into communion, not only with God, but with others of all stripes, right? All types of creatures, maybe we could say precisely by being called into communion with others, we are deepening our communion with God. And that is, if we are really truly open to the world and to others, and that self-actualization is happening among us, it's also going to give life to the rest of creation simply by following the gospel, which is, I think, again, it sounds so simple. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that, but that's the kind of vision that I'm trying to, put forward.
Well, you after kind of laying out the idea and the method, you then do look into kind of resources for this perspective in Scripture and tradition. Why don't you say a little bit about how you draw on the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament?
For sure. Yeah. So starting with Scripture, I think that one of the most significant things, I'll just maybe two quick examples that come to mind, are in the book of Genesis. I have always been struck, but until I did this research, never really got fully into it, fully understood it. Until then, I've always been struck by that phrase, let there be, or let the earth bring forth, right? That this phrasing, the let there, it's kind of a passive, active invitation. God, contrary to, kind of the popular imagination, in Genesis 1, God doesn't put things on the earth. God invites the earth to respond and bring forth of its own accord. So the initiative is with God, but the agency is actually with the earth. Let the earth bring forth every kind of vegetation, right? So the earth is doing the work there. God is empowering, enabling, drawing that liveliness out of the earth. And I think that's consistent with this idea that God is a God who desires the fullness of life for all things. And that also challenges those really, harmful anthropocentric logics that say then, well, God is the overlord ruler, right? Sort of old man with a beard in the sky that, imposes God's will on the earth. And so we are in the image of God, those who impose our will on the earth. It reverses all of that. And it says God is a God who draws out the fullness of what is possible from what God makes, And then we, as those created in the image of God, are not gifted with power. We are gifted with love. And so the fullness of what it means to be human is not to assert power or rational control over things, as much of the philosophical tradition would have it. The fullness of the human person is the ability to cooperate with God through love in God's life-giving intentions and to bring out the fullness of what can be. Right. And so that reframing happens when we kind of see that. So that's one thing. If we go to Genesis 3 and the punishment narrative in particular of the woman, right? Woman is punished with subjection to the man after, the garden incident, shall we call it, and the thing that I think a lot of people, again, if we're thinking about fundamental life-giving intentions, a lot of people miss is that although that phrase, he shall rule over you, has been used as a warrant for patriarchy and the subordination of women and all sorts of horrible things, including violence against women, the reality is that because that is a punishment that comes after the first incident of sin, that means that something changed. Before that, it wasn't that way. God didn't intend it to be that way. God didn't intend that subjection. The woman has to be punished with it, right? And that's not a justification of it whatsoever. Rather, it's showing how wrong it is, how unjust it is, because there's that fundamental contrast between God's intentions and the current situation. And I think we can follow that logic all the way through the tradition. It leads us, in my reading of the tradition, sometimes to figures that we don't talk about often, but it also, in the New Testament, reshapes how we understand Christ's love as this revolutionary force made incarnate in a human person. I go to the story of Jesus and picking grain on the Sabbath, the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath. And he says, well, what's more important, to follow the law or to, make sure people's bodily needs are cared for, right? Or Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats final judgment, right? Providing food, water. It all starts with the material. It all starts with embodied love within community for others. And then it goes to the spiritual. And I think flourishing kind of helps us to see that in a really, kind of unique and a new way, in a new light.
You also look at other figures from the tradition. Irenaeus, obviously the famous line, "Glory of God is the human being fully alive."
Yeah.
This could have been an epigraph for your book.
Absolutely. I thought about it.
And what about Hildegard of Bingen? She's a wonderful.
Yeah. Well, so, there's a parallel, I think, between Irenaeus and Hildegard both in terms of how they have been interpreted and some of the stuff that I discovered when I put this lens of flourishing on their work. Often we go to, the glory of God as the human person fully alive in Irenaeus, let's say, or we go to Hildegard's concept of viriditas and we say, oh, greenness, liveliness, it's this great ecological metaphor, right? Mm-hmm. Well, there's sort of a inverse correlation between the two of them. Irenaeus's statement about the human person comes as the culmination of a discourse on creation, where the human person is situated in the created order and is deeply connected. He calls it the plasma, right? The dirt that God creates the earth creature out of in Genesis 2. So he uses that to make this really interesting connection between humans and the rest of creation, and then goes to human fulfillment. So it's not this sort of glorified anthropocentric perspective, and it's not just humans. So conversely, Hildegard's idea of viriditas is not just ecological. And the richness of it, I think, comes out because viriditas is the greenness of all things. It is the fulfillment of God's life-giving intention for all things, including humans. So humans have their own viriditas. We have our own greenness that God is kind of nurturing to fulfillment in the way that a gardener works in a garden. Hildegard herself, a famous, herbalist and gardener. So she uses these ecological metaphors to understand the whole of creation in terms of God's life-giving intentions, such that, human morality, for example, the coming into the fullness of who we are as people called to the good, as people called to love, is an example of human viriditas kind of reaching its fulfillment in the same way that a plant growing, blossoming, and blooming is that plant's viriditas coming to fulfillment. So in both cases, there's these really beautiful sort of integrations of the ecological and the human that I think really emphasize our interconnectedness, our relationship to the rest of creation, and the fact that God desires that fullness of life for all things. So that was one of the things I was really struck by in reading those two is that we often we use little taglines or tag words, but then I got into, reading them more fully, and I was like, wow, there's something really interesting going on here in terms of how they arrive at those statements, about the full human person fully alive or viriditas.
Well, a lot of Irenaeus and some of those early church fathers, they were specifically writing against Gnosticism,
Yeah.
and which kind of deprecated material existence,
Reality, yeah.
in favor of the spirit, and that exists still in the kind of Platonic philosophy that runs through Christian spirituality. But they were kind of banking everything on this idea that God entered into creation,
Yeah.
into humanity, into the earth,
Into materiality. Yeah. Yeah.
There was no kind of salvation apart from that. I mean, it was not,
Absolutely not.
It was not by escaping our materiality or our created status.
Yeah, and we get that as early as, the letter, the Johannine, John's Gospel and the Johannine letters, right? Going all the way back to Scripture. We see these early, little Gnostic impulses starting to creep in, where people will say, oh, Jesus wasn't really dying on the cross. His body didn't really matter. And the first letter of John starts, famously with that series of statements. What we have seen with our eyes, what we have touched, what we have looked at concerns this word of life. Word of life being Christ. But again, all sense language, what we saw, what we heard, what we touched. So it's all about materiality. And then that letter proceeds, as do Gregory of Nyssa, Irenaeus, everyone, to really try to resituate the message of salvation in material existence and not apart from it. But and I think we see that actually in Paul too, and I make a lot of this in the book because Paul is famous for being used as a source for the separation of flesh and spirit. But I don't think that's really the case if we understand what Paul is up to. The famous line, the place I go there is it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, as a full, a statement of what this self-actualization looks like. Christ living in us. But then he goes on to say, and the life I now live in sarx in Greek, in the flesh, right? The life I now live in the flesh is the life of right? So he's not saying the life of the spirit, the life of as some sort of, supernatural dimension of the human person. The life I now live in the flesh, in my own flesh and bones, in my materiality. So I think that, we receive as kids, as people growing up, as students, sometimes we receive these easy separations of flesh and spirit or material and divine, those kinds of things. I don't think the tradition is so keen on that separation. And I try to show that because flourishing is all about our embodied care for others and our love for others in materiality, in the flesh. And after all, that's what Christ entered into, right, in order to bring about whatever this salvation is.
Well, this book is largely devoted to establishing flourishing as a kind of root metaphor or lens or hermeneutic for understanding the whole Christian kind of idea and project. Maybe it's unfair to ask you, but in the future, do you intend to look at how this would shape our Christology or ecclesiology or
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're certainly talking about eschatology here, but
For sure. Yes. I think that the answer to all those questions is yes. I want to continue to follow this trajectory of flourishing as a root metaphor, for everything, and ask, I dabble in it here and there as I trace the tradition, but then really to unpack and elaborate, some of those dimensions. At the end of the book, after I propose this framework, I go to discernment, and I say that all of this in Christian life is fulfilled in what I call amor mundi, right? Love of the world, that involves this deep attunement to and reflection on the whole of reality. I play with Ignatius. Sentire, he talks about sentire cum ecclesia. I talk about sentire cum terra, the earth, and sentire, thinking and feeling with humanum, the human reality as a whole. And that when we do that with flourishing in mind, we are called to this deep love of the world. Now, what that love of the world looks like, of course, is going to be different for everyone. And so, to be able to sort of bridge that out into, say, Christology and say, what does, let's do a deeper dive into who Christ was, what Christ proclaimed, what the gospel writers say about Christ, and let's do it through the lens of flourishing. And then what do we see that we couldn't see before, right? Let's go back to the doctrine of God, to the Trinity, right? And talk about these, relationships of love and God's relationship to the world, and, processions, and, all the things that we talk about in the traditional sort of discourse, and say, okay, what does flourishing say about this God who intends the fullness of life for all creation? I already have a few ideas about where that could go. But I'll say this, the third place that I think comes immediately to mind is pneumatology. I make a lot out of spirit in the book. And I think that, still to this day, the Spirit's presence and work in creation is sort of one of the lesser talked about, lesser known, dimensions of God's work among us. But I think flourishing is all about the Spirit of life working among us. And so a fully realized pneumatology, that takes flourishing as a lens and then says, okay, how do we understand the Spirit working in and among us and with us and around us? And what does that mean for what it means to be Christian? I think there are really rich things, not just for me to do, but I hope that, a book like this can start a conversation that inspires, theologians working across, disciplines and across subdisciplines to be able to say, okay, well, let me bring flourishing to the table and see what happens. It's sort of the rest is history kind of scenario, but I don't know. I don't know, but it hopefully a start of a conversation that will touch on all those dimensions.
Well, I very much look forward to listening in on that conversation. Part of it, I'm very glad to. I started by quoting Beth Johnson, and I wondered if you also had just a wonderful line that I also think kind of is a summary.
Sure.
She says, in a surprising and originating sense, God is not ondialectically the ground of everything that is, but is the ground of what should be and we hope will be, the power of being over the ravages of non-being, as pure aliveness in relation, the unoriginate welling up of fullness of life in which the whole universe participates. This kind of this beatific kind of vision. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you,
and
great.
I urge everyone to read this, I think, groundbreaking and really important book, A Theology of Flourishing, the Fullness of Life for All Creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.